Okay, the recorder has begun. Okay, so again, welcome. Thank you for tuning in to the second of the webinars this month for Agile Scrum, and this one focuses on the product backlog. So for a traditional project manager like myself, love the product backlog. A great tool for managing everything. And the title is interesting here. Don't start with the end in mind. It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of title because the product backlog is the end, but it's allowed to change from when you start the project to the very final delivery. And that's the whole concept about being agile. You have to adapt and adopt along the project path to building a truly valuable and successful product and project. So let's go into the agenda. The agenda looks like we're covering a ton of material, but these are basically just the slide titles. And we have to understand the product backlog is key to planning, so we'll go into the planning onion, and then we talk about the product owner and the product backlog and all of the elements within the product backlog. Okay, and again, I'm just going to pause for a second. I'm getting Rihanna, just in the background, I'm getting a lot of comments that people can't hear anything, but I do see my headset broadcasting, and okay, and then I can see I'm getting some messages that you can hear okay. Okay, I'm going to continue on, and then unfortunately, if anyone can't hear, they'll have the recordings at the end. Okay, but we're going to start off with the planning onion, and the planning onion focuses in the two middle levels here around the product backlog and the release backlog. So the high-level corporate strategy and the portfolio planning and high-level strategic product planning, that all remains the same as any other type of project management. But when you get into an Agile and a Scrum approach to Agile project, then we get into the requirements management. And that's all done through the product backlog. And then the release is that portion of the product backlog, which is the current sponsored project and what we're going to be delivering at the end. And then the sprints are the activity, the development activity that develops this release backlog in its time bar stages. So this presentation is focused in this area right here. So we have to start off, someone has to own that activity and that product backlog. That's the role of the product owner. And the product owner is everything and all things to the product backlog. So from Scrum advice, the role belongs to one person. So here's someone with a tie. This would be our product owner. The product owner can have multiple products, but for every product, there's only one person that owns that product. Therefore, the role is accountable. It can be full-time or part-time, but again, if you choose the approach to have a person own more than one product, definitely it's full-time. A business-oriented role that doesn't need to be a developer or know the application. It's all about gathering all of the requirements from all of the stakeholders and putting them into the product backlog as a very simple story. So we need business skills, not technical skills. And then we can prioritize the work to make sure we're doing the most important things as we go through each sprint of the overall project. And we can monitor the overall project and release goals and progress along the way. And we talk about communicating effectively with the customer, but we really want to say customer and stakeholders. Because anyone, if you have some type of requirement for the product, can put the requirement into the product backlog. And then there will be a touch base to the team doing the development work, but the product owner only has to be there to clarify user stories, and the team quite often goes directly to the customer to get that clarification. So now that we've got our product owner, managing the product backlog and managing also that portion of the product backlog, the release, which is the project, we go into this definition. So the product backlog, it's an ordered and prioritized and sequenced list of everything that needs to be done in the final project. Well, actually, we should say the final product. So the product backlog is product focused, and even if you're not going to do it in the current project, we have one place, a single point of documentation or requirements. Anything that relates to this product that we may or may not be doing goes in the product backlog. So the product backlog is everything. And then we have the items here. Items are basically these building blocks to your product backlog. They're simple, they're non-technical, they're business language. We'll talk a bit about this in the next slide. Every stakeholder can put something that they want done to the product backlog. For example, refactoring. Refactoring is cleaning up code that may have been rushed to get some feature in a particular sprint. So that's not something the customer really cares about, but that's something the development team says, this is a part of our product we want to go, and we have value to refactoring that and keeping it manageable. And so all we have to do is, no matter where the feature comes from, we order it based upon the business value. And the higher up in the stack that the feature goes, the more valuable it is. Okay, so key about the product backlog, it's good to have database tools for this. You can do it with a spreadsheet, but spreadsheets lose their functionality when you get a bit more detail and depth and complexity. So anyway, every requirement is reflected in the product backlog. Everything you want to do but may never get to do is in the product backlog for the product. Or in an ITSM sense, this could also be a service product backlog. So now that we've got our product backlog, a little bit about how these items are structured in the product backlog. So we talk about items and user stories. In fact, there's a whole bunch of different names for those these items or these pieces in the product backlog. Generically, they're items. One of the techniques for documenting these is user stories, and they're often called user stories, or you could simply refer to them as a feature or as a requirement. So whichever way you're referring to it, that's what this slide talks about, items and user stories. This is the most common way we refer to things in the product backlog. And the user story is the most common way to gather the requirement. And being agile, we want to avoid any upfront waste. Documenting requirements in detail upfront is a waste. And so the user stories are a very simple way of gathering just enough information not to allow developers to go ahead and start developing. It's enough to allow developers to say, I've got an idea of what needs to be done, and now I've got an idea of what questions and collaboration I have to do with whoever the owner of the user story is. So Agile and Scrum want to make sure you only have just enough information that when you begin work, you have a rough idea of it, and then you have to go back to your stakeholders to get more details. So the format is, as a user type, so when I do different project work, I have a roles catalog. Here's all the different roles that are going to be working or involved in this particular service or product. And then based upon the role that you have, what do you want to do? What's your action? You want something that's a functional requirement. And then it's going to produce some type of desired result. So these are the three basic elements that go into the product backlog stories, right? Roles, what is the role doing, some type of action, and then what's the outcome of that action. Okay, and so very simple to create these. And again, don't worry about getting it right. It's enough information to start a conversation. and this is the key thing with Agile and the Scrum approach within Agile. It's all about just enough to start conversations. Agile is all about collaboration and conversations. That takes the place of excessive documentation. And usually when we try and document things, we never get it right anyway. So Agile is a very lean and efficient way of doing things. And so the next piece in the items and user stories slide, each of these user stories or items follows the INVEST guideline. So each story has to be independent. And just going back a slide, feature F versus feature D, these have to be independent, because if feature F had to come before feature D, well, then I'd better combine them together, because each of these things have to be prioritized and be able to independently move up and down in the product backlog. So we can't move things up and down in the product backlog unless we're independent. So the next thing we have to do then is make it negotiable. And there's a couple of things that kind of go along with the concept of negotiable. I can negotiate regarding the value of the story, and based upon that negotiation and the value of the story, I can move things up or down. And we also need an estimate of effort. So, you know, Agile doesn't mean we don't do any planning, or we simply say we'll be done when we're done. We have no idea when. Each of these stories is given a high-level effort type estimate. It could be story points, which is a comparative estimating technique, or it could be ideal time, which again is a not a time commitment, but an ideal time guess. And because the story is high level, these user stories are very simple, right? It's a rough estimate. But if you use the same technique for all of these different stories, you find that it actually works out fairly accurate in the long run. And so we put up, for each of these stories, we do a rough estimate, and as they approach the top, we'll get more refined in our estimates. Because they're independent and negotiable, they're also estimatable. And as much as possible, as things float to the top of the product backlog, make them as small as possible. And everything needs good quality, so that it needs to be testable as well. So this is our story. We want to fill that product backlog with just enough information to be able to come up with priority of unique independent tasks that can be prioritized based on value, and then broken down to their smallest component. So we'd have to do another definition, epics and themes. So when we're talking about this product backlog, and we go back here and we talk about breaking things down to small components, again, Agile and Scrum want to be efficient. So an epic is a user story that's too big, meaning that the story has not been broken down based upon that INVEST small principle. And usually, if things are at the bottom part of the product backlog, they're not of high priority, so it's okay to have these things at a large story level, at an epic level. Because we can still estimate epics and we can still move them around. It's just that they can be broken down into multiple smaller independent stories as you start to move up to the top. So in this particular slide example, these features down here may be the concept of epics. And then and this may have been one particular epic story that's been broken down into their independent and INVEST small user stories. So as things move to the top, that's where we get more refined, and everything fits that INVEST principle. So the other thing is, as things start breaking down into these small components, I'm going to lose track of what does each component do. Now, I could simply try and get complicated and say all of these user stories relate to this epic story. But then it gets complicated in the product backlog. So instead, there's another basic column in the product backlog, which is the theme. And so the theme is basically another column I could put to the left here, and then what I'm trying to do is for all of my different user stories, I can start saying all of these stories here belong to theme A, right? And then these are independent. These are big epics down here, so they might be themes on their own. Or maybe feature F is another low priority piece of theme A. And theme A tends to be, or themes tend to be the way to group things together to have a combination of components that are of value to the end stakeholder. Right, so this is how we keep track of all of our different stories and put them in and group them together into to these themes. Okay, so we have epics, which are big, items and user stories are the small pieces. They come in epic and themes for grouping. So now we've pretty much got our product backlog organized. So now we can go ahead, because we've got all the concepts there, ordering the product backlog, which we've talked about before. So this is where the product owner is the one who's going to be ordering the product backlog items. They don't do it alone. They do it in combination with whichever stakeholder and ultimately whoever the customer, whoever the one is who's sponsoring and is the accountable business end of the product, they're going to be at the other end saying, here's what's valuable to me. So, so we can order the product backlog quickly using subjective techniques like the Moscow technique. And the Moscow technique is break things up into must have, should have, could have, and won't have at this time. So this is where we get the formations. When we get the sort of the coulds and the won't have at this time, these are things which may fall off of the release backlog because they're not high enough priority for the current project. So anyway, it's a quick subjective way to get things organized. And then as things are maybe approaching the top, then it may be I want to become more objective and put in some actual value in financial type of calculations, such as return on investment or net present value. And that's all based upon benefit and cost. And the other way we could also add into the prioritization is risk. So we might want to do a maybe a low financial benefit and cost activity first because the risk is very high and we'd rather manage the risk and get it out of the way. So there's a lot of art and science, more science actually than art, but going into managing and ordering the product backlog. And that's where the product owner, you can see where they're going to have a full-time role. There is no project manager in Agile and Scrum, but having been a project manager, PMP, traditional project manager, I would say that if I were to move into Agile projects, I would be more aligned to being a product owner, where I could move and manage and prioritize this product backlog to get the project and the product properly sequenced in how I'm going to bring it out. So now that we've got our product backlog totally organized, as I mentioned, with that subjective measure of must have, could have, should have, now we can do the release planning. And again, it's done with the product owner in collaboration with the customer and all stakeholders. And again, from the product backlog, we earmark these are the things that must, should, or could be done. And anything down below falls off. We still keep track of it because everything about the product is in the product backlog, but they fall off our list. And so we're sponsored, we're approved to work on these items, either a time-based project or a scope-based project. And we can plan the next part of the release planning is saying, well, during During the project and the release itself, each iteration is a sprint. At the end of each sprint, whatever is done is potentially shippable. So are we going to be shipping and deploying parts of a product or service into the production environment at the end of each sprint? Or maybe every 3 sprints, we then have some type of deployment or release. So there's 2 parts to release planning. Release planning is the overall project. That's the first part of release. By the end of the project, this is what we hope to have released and in production. And then because Agile and Scrum work to create user stories that are done and potentially shippable and deployable, we could be deploying at the end of each sprint, or again, come up with a release plan. It could be ad hoc or based upon predefined intervals. So we're getting towards the end. So now we've got our project underway. The last thing we have to do is talk about with these user stories. Most of the user stories are going to be functional. In fact, I would say all of the user stories are going to be functional. Functionality specifies what something is to do. It's the features and functions that my different customers and stakeholders want. It's my working features. It's the things that provide the functional purpose, all of these types of operational type activities. But you can never get full value without also considering non-functional requirements. So non-functional requirements are about how things behave, and it's really focused on quality and usability aspects, such as performance, capacity, availability, security. So to be done, we need to obviously write and complete the functional requirements according to the stakeholder needs, and we need to meet the non-functional requirements according to your release or development practice standards and practice manager. This is the quality aspect that can't be missed. So as part of the product owner and the development team, what they're going to come up with around all of those user stories in the product backlog to make sure we properly complete functional and non-functional requirements, we come up with the definition of done. So the definition of done is agreed upon, again, by not just the product owner, but also the development team and the stakeholders and the Scrum Master. Everyone is there saying, what do we need to do to make sure we get a good quality product? And so all of my development processes and other organizational processes, the non-functional and quality criteria, these are all the things that go into the definition of done. And so the definition of done is basically a quality checklist to make sure that everyone agrees these are the things that will make every unique user story and work item done 100%, as well. And it's usually focused on the non-functional requirements as well as, and the overall definition of done goes back to complete the functional requirements, get the stakeholders agreeing that functionally things are working correctly, and then for your development managers or release managers who come up with the quality checklist, get your non-functional requirements specified. So if you were to have an ITIL or ITSM approach, and in that approach you have a release management quality kind of development check, this is where you would put the pieces in. Okay, so we're ready to build our project. The product backlog has been properly refined and groomed and prepared in advance for everything we're trying to do for the release. So completing the product backlog is now, in the previous presentation I did about just sprints and Scrum in general, we now go into sprint planning. The product owner and the product and the development team talk about what are the top items that we want to pull off of the top of the product backlog that will fit into the time box of the current sprint. And once we get these things moved over, they're broken down by the development team into individual tasks to get better estimates and a better understanding of what needs to be done. And then we begin our daily execution. Every morning, typically we start off with a daily Scrum meeting. We continue for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever your sprint length is. We gradually get all of these items done according to the definition of done. And then at the end of the sprint, we can demo the completed items, when that's all done and everyone has agreed, we're signed off, we're good, the sprint team does a sprint retrospective, and then they begin the next day sprint planning back with the product owner again. So then this is how we, in an agile, continuous, cyclical way, we go through and continue to work our way through the release backlog, which is now the project backlog. And at any time, the stakeholders or the product owner can go and reshuffle the product or release backlog, or add new items or remove items. The only rule in Agile and Scrum is that if these are the items that are earmarked for the current sprint, then they're off limits to the product owner and the stakeholders, unless there's a driving business reason to cancel those items. They're locked. They're locked. They're in the development stream, and we don't randomly change the development stream. So the only thing that can be modified is are these pieces down here, because they're not locked and loaded into the sprint. So when we talk about product backlog grooming and refinement, it's always to the pieces that are not currently being worked on. Okay, and so that's our kind of lean and efficient coverage of the product backlog and the product owner, and how we set up this product backlog, how we choose the correct items that make up the release, the project, and then once we have it set up, we continuously go through the sprints to work our way down the priority of the product backlog. Okay, so we're done the presentation. Just a quick comment about next steps if you want more details. But of course, we have the, being a training and consulting firm, we have the Scrum Foundation certification course, as well as the Agile Scrum Master and Leader certification courses. This material is sort of a source from across the foundation and a little bit from the Scrum Master. And you can find more of this information and some white papers and other things around a whole host of topics in your mypinkportal.com. And so here's where I'll thank everyone, but before we wrap up, I'll take a look to see if there's questions. And I think Rihanna has been assisting and may be able to show me if there's any questions here. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. One question here. I think that's from Rihanna. Yeah, we'll send out the presentation deck and the recordings to everyone after this event. And if anyone experienced any, well, you won't hear this, but if you experienced any audio issues, apologies for that. But again, the recordings will fill in for what was maybe missed. Okay, question number one, how do you deal with dependencies? So dependencies go back to, here we go, this slide over here, all around the invest principle, right? And if you have dependencies, then something is not truly independent. And so in the product backlog, let's say that feature A and B were two pieces that were dependent. Feature A would never work without feature B. So is there any point in my separating those things? No, because again, if I develop feature A and then feature B just continues to sort of drop down the list for whatever reason, I'll never get it done. So what we would do, we would keep feature A and B joined together, and we can then keep them as an item. And down here, when we bring it into the sprint, that's where we can break it down to a set of related tasks. And this is where a user story that might be big because of dependency can be split over multiple sprints, because we can still break it down to the independent pieces, but the story is not complete until we get the second one done. So that's how we could manage it with still fitting it in a sprint and getting part of it done, but knowing that it's still related. And then another question here about how do you relate ITIL transition processes and product release and so on to the product backlog. The whole ITIL framework relates to the product backlog primarily around the concept of the definition of done. So the definition of done are my organizational processes, such as making sure we have an SLA for whatever product or feature, making sure we have availability, capacity, and continuity, these types of things designed for every feature, making sure we go through the proper release and quality checks and testing and validation. So the ITIL framework is basically applied to the non-functional requirements, because in ITIL, it's got everything built in. This is the concept of warranty. And so if you have a release and a development team, they're the ones who are going to be making sure we do a good quality job. And if you're following the ITIL framework, then it becomes a checklist in the ITIL framework to say, make sure all these things are done. The only thing you would do is you would keep things combined or managed using change management, but it wouldn't be a very hands-on change management. It would be a very loose change management, waiting for the end of the sprint demo to say, what do you have for me? That's already been passed based upon the definition of done. And is there anything which we need to track and manage to be deployed? Another question here about, do you keep, for keeping items related. Yeah, you could also keep items related. If items are, how would I use the term? If items are related based upon large business functionality, if, for example, all of these dark blue features made up a basic web page and basic information for some type of system, then we could still say, well, we could build it in pieces, and each individual piece would go out. But if these are all part of a theme, that's a way of saying this has business value. It can be broken down, and each piece has independent value, but together they have larger value. Okay, and then lots of questions coming in here. So question about, would you consider a project manager to be a product owner? There is nowhere anyone has documented that. Everyone says there is no project managers in Agile and Scrum. But having been a project manager, I would say that the Scrum Master and Coach is not the best place to put it, excuse me, because the Scrum Master is a coaching and facilitative role, and project managers like to get their hands on. So it depends upon what your skill set is as a project manager. Some might be better suited for the product backlog if you want to be hands-on in sequencing and prioritizing. Others who are more of the people and facilitative type project managers, they're better suited in as a Scrum coach. And a last question here, another question, do you have to get agreement on done for each slice? Yes, you do. And generally speaking, though, each of these features in a cohesive product need the same definition of done. You can't have high quality for that feature and low quality for this feature, because then your product's going to be unstable. So the concept with the definition of done, one product, one definition of done. These are all the checks and balances and things we do to keep the product in consistent quality. Again, you can't shortcut in one area, then make changes in the other. And let's see, there's one last question here. I mentioned eliminating waste and understanding incremental development. Wouldn't going back and forth to get more story details be considered waste? Actually, no. And so in the concept of efficiency and waste, all of these user stories are down here. They're epics. And so let me go to my epic slide. So they're epics, and therefore they may be high level, and I haven't got to break them down yet because I don't know, am I doing feature E or feature F, right? It may change prioritization and sequencing during the project. So you have to remember there's no point in my doing detail work down here because I don't know if it'll still keep the same order by the time it gets to the top. Because in Agile and Scrum, you can always move things around based upon value. And at the top of the product backlog, that's where you can now break things down to smaller stories. And then when you begin your sprint, this is where the development team goes back to the stakeholders to get more information. And so the concept of where it's sufficient and lean, I didn't waste a lot of time writing everything down at the beginning when people might not actually know the full details of the requirements. As different items are done, the product starts to evolve. People can see the demo of the live working software and product, and then they can say, oh, well, now I've got a better idea of what I want for these other user stories. So it's actually very efficient to do this in this Agile approach. It takes a bit of practice, as with all things. Okay, so it looks like those are all the questions. And so, great. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for another of our Agile series. Looking forward to doing another one sometime soon. And to keep your lunchtime in respect here, I'll give you back the rest of your day. As I mentioned, the recordings will be available to you. I'm just going to stop them now, and then this can be sent to you after the presentation. Okay, everyone enjoy your Tuesday, and we'll see you again soon.